Hello and welcome to episode 2 of our Back to Basics video series. Today we're joined by Louise Volskink, an investment specialist at New Road Capital, and she's going to be taking us through some risk measures that are commonly used. Thank you for joining us today, Louise.
Thank you, Jess.
So to get us started, we often hear about standard deviation. Can you tell us exactly what that is?
Yes, so the standard deviation is arguably the most commonly used measure of risk in the world of investments. And another word to use to describe it is the volatility that you do experience in your investment or in your fund. So just to give a practical example, if I have a fund that have an average return of 10% and I then have a standard deviation of 2, what that just basically means is that on average the return of that fund will then vary between 8 and 12%. And then if I add more volatility to the fund and the standard deviation is higher, for example 5%, what that then means is that on average, the return of that fund will then vary between 5 and 15%. So so the higher your standard deviation or the volatility in your fund is, the more uncertain the range of your returns will then be.
All right, and then another risk measure that's also used, but it's not as common, is the Sharpe ratio. So what exactly is that?
Yeah, so the Sharpe ratio is the most widely used risk and return measure in the world of investments. And basically it's just the risk-adjusted return. So it just essentially tells you how much risk that I take on to get the return of my investment.
All right, so if Fund A, for example, has a higher return than Fund B, does that mean that it's also going to have a higher Sharpe ratio?
Yeah, so not necessarily, Jess. So so a lot of investors can actually get caught up in just looking at the returns and then kind of forgetting about the risk involved or associated with getting that return. And that is essentially what the Sharpe ratio is for. Just to say, how much risk did I take on to get that, that higher return. So if I, for example, have a fund that gave me a return of 5% and I have a standard deviation of, also 5, my Sharpe ratio is then 1. But then if I lower my standard deviation and I still get my return of 5%, it's just essentially saying I took on less risk to get the same return. And that's essentially what the Sharpe ratio is for, just to say how much risk did I take on to get a particular return.
Okay, so then the second example would then be a better investment to use.
Yes.
All right, and then maybe just to end us off here, what exactly is the maximum drawdown of a fund or investment?
Yeah, so the maximum drawdown is a measure of taking in a fund, from the highest point in a fund to a lower point in a fund, in your particular investment period. So if, for example, I currently have a return of 20% in my fund, and then that return in the investment then fall to, for example, 5%. That fall from the 20%, the high point, to the 5%, the low point. Just that drawdown, that is your maximum drawdown. And essentially what that measure just tells us is, that the bigger your maximum drawdown is, potentially it can take longer to make up that, loss from 20% to 5%, just to get back from that 5% to the 20%. That can potentially take higher to make up that returns again.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to tune in again for our next episode of our Back to Basics video series.